Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Selling a little or a lot? Shopify helps you do your thing however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit a million orders stage. Shopify is there to help you grow. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout. 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Get a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/work. Shopify.com/work.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes per details.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale, and today I have the pleasure of talking to Robert P. Kolker and Marsha Gordon on the 5th edition of Robert Kolker's groundbreaking textbook, Film, Form and Culture. The book is a remarkable introduction to cinema in all its aspects, including the history and the physical making of film, as well as providing outlines to the major genres and theoretical discussions that go on in terms of our reception of film. In this edition, you find an updated selection of examples, and it's been revised extensively and is available also for teachers who can receive examination copies if they go to the Routledge website. I'll put a link in my show notes. We discussed lots of topics, so it's a really interesting discussion. Robert, of course, we had on earlier this year talking about his new Stanley Kubrick biography, and Marsha has written widely on cinema, including a book on the work of Samuel Fuller, one of those filmmakers who is growing in reputation, rightfully so. If you enjoy the episode, please remember to review if you can. Leave star ratings, preferably good ones, and do everything you can to make this podcast available to as wide an audience as possible. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
So one of the things that I think is important to acknowledge is that film, form, and culture began with Bob Kolker. He is the one who wrote this book on his own, and that was first published in 1999. And I've been using it for many years as my textbook and introduction to film. And what I always admired about the book was its elegance of prose, its sophistication of writing, its poetic, it's lyrical about film, form, and culture. It's not just a dry textbook conveying information and film titles, and this is a cut, and this is a shot, and this is high key lighting. It is, of course, defining all of these important concepts for an introduction to film class, but it is also modeling beautiful writing. And to me, the fact that this book is a pleasure to read should be both inspiring to students who want to think in a sophisticated way about film, but also to anyone who wants to just learn a little bit more about the way film works. And so I think in that way, it is readable. It is the kind of book that if you are a generalist who's just interested in film, you could take great pleasure reading this book. And I'm not patting myself on the back here. This is all stemming from Bob and his, I think, career-long commitment to being a beautiful writer about film, not just a writer about film.
Which is something we want to celebrate on this podcast as much as possible, obviously. Bob, I wondered, going back to 1999, of course, at that point in history, teaching film and film education was not necessarily as widespread as it is today, perhaps. Or let me frame that more as a question. How has the teaching of film and the presence of film in colleges and universities and schools, how has that changed in the past 25 years?
Well, even in the late 90s, it was fairly well entrenched. Film studies is taught, I think, across country, across the world now. Sometimes it is linked with media studies, cultural studies, all of which are covered in the book. I also wanted to point out and add to what Marsha was saying that the book started out partially as a pedagogical, technical, and licensing experiment, because the original edition came with a DVD that had film clips in it, along with narration and diagrams and a whole slew of ways to look at the image that complemented the written text. And that continued well into the 2000s until clips became widely available online or on DVDs that more and more film schools had. This is partly an answer to your question. Libraries of DVDs and Blu-rays are now quite typical, the way they were not at the time when the book was first put together. So now the book is just richly illustrated with still images, and the instructor is free to supplement them, not with clips, I think, anymore, but with actual films, entire films.
And if I may add to the question about introduction to film classes too, and the way film studies is taught globally, it is astonishing how many institutions, and I'm not just talking about university, also what we would call high school in the United States. I often get students, high school, community colleges, transfer students who have had some exposure to film in their courses. Sometimes it's only part of a course because they don't have a dedicated film studies instructor. Sometimes it's taught very much in a kind of literary studies mode, more analysis without attention to form, the way film is constructed, which is central to this textbook. But I do think that as our culture has shifted more and more to a culture oriented to the visual, to now the streaming, that, what we used to call media literacy, the ability to think about the images that young people are seeing in particular has become more and more urgent. One might even argue a crisis. And so I think teaching young people, teaching all people who have not had the education to think about film and moving images critically, because even though this book is called Film, Form, and Culture, as we acknowledge in this 5th edition, what is film anymore? There are very few films that are shot on film and shown on film anymore. And so as the object of study itself has changed, become more ubiquitous and accessible on the one hand, and also kind of more challenging to access on the other. For example, if I am wanting to teach a film that is a Netflix release, often there's no DVD of that film. I would have to subscribe to Netflix in order to show it. There's no physical media anymore. And that's a very alarming situation for those of us who teach in this area. But there's so much going on with the way film and media has changed in the past certainly decade. I feel like there's been an accelerated change that helping people understand the consequences for that is extremely important.
From that perspective, the book very much pushes a point that you need to consider film history, that film was not invented with Netflix. And so there's a great deal of time spent on older films, on black and white films, even on silent films. There are sections on Buster Keaton and D.W. Griffith, just to contextualize history for students so that they can place what they are seeing with other older defining cinematic events.
Yeah, I thought I really appreciated those sections. I thought it was really interesting as well how you're looking at people who are really inventing the language and the grammar of cinema. And so when you go back to form, one of the words in your title, it's almost as if really in order to define what we're talking about in terms of cinema, form is maybe the key rather than film, as in the materiality or the celluloid or the screen. It's the way you tell a story. And I think you make a point in the book that there is a delimitation. There are demarcations. There are certain points where a TikTok video is not a film.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, as we updated the textbook, we were mindful of these shifts both in media production, in media production, distribution, and consumption, right? No longer just exhibition, now that people are looking at so much of the media they look at every day on their phones or iPads or laptops or what have you, but that some of the fundamental principles of the way images are constructed and create meaning do carry over and are relevant to these new forms that media is taking today. And so while the book is, grounded in film history, moving out of that to the contemporary day, and one of the things that Bob and I really worked on was thinking about, well, how have genres changed, for example? So there's this genre that didn't exist, until fairly recently, the superhero film, right? This has been somewhat ubiquitous, I think perhaps on the wane, but it has been somewhat ubiquitous. But we felt it was important to bring in discussions of that genre, which the students are very familiar with, but also to think about, for example, the way that Wonder Woman, the Patty Jenkins film that was such a box office success globally, is at its fundamental base, it's a melodrama. And so we tie it to these much older traditions that, date back, to the 19th century in literature and then to the early 20th in film, so that students can understand that what they're seeing may be a kind of a new genre, but it's an iteration of an old genre. And even the idea of special effects and spectacle, that's you can trace to the late 1890s in the work of Georges Méliès, for example, the French magician turned filmmaker.
And there's even a newer form called Afrofuturism that is widespread. I mean, all the way from the Wakanda films to films made in Africa themselves. So we've really tried in the space allotted to cover the scope of cinema.
And let me add to that, because I think that was a really one of the hardest challenges of working on a textbook, which I could never have appreciated until I actually got on the other side of it with Bob, went through the portal of having to make these decisions, is that, for everything you include, you're excluding 100 other things, right? It's a very painful process in some ways, because both of us have the things that we really care about and that we tend to teach and want to write about. And then we have to also think about students who are oriented to different forms of media, and how do we balance the canonical with the new. Bob and I are both Americanists at heart in many ways, and so how do we also think about film in a global context, which it always was, right? It was never an American idea, an American invention. It was happening all over the world. And so as we worked on this edition, one of the things we did was really expand the global sections of the textbook. So now we have, even though, they're far from comprehensive, but we have sections in this edition on India and Iran and Nigeria and South Korea and Japan and Burkina Faso. And so we really tried to be kind of globally mindful in an effort to make it clear that this is an intro textbook. We are kind of cracking open a door, right, and giving readers an opportunity to be exposed to a lot of things, but hopefully not overwhelmed by too much exposure, which was also another balance we really worked to strike, so that there's enough depth, but also enough of a gesture towards filmmakers and films that we think readers might be interested in pursuing on their own.
Yeah, it's sort of the accordion effect, to say enough that will then be ready to be opened up by the instructor, filled in, movies shown, ideas expanded, and hopefully students' perceptions expanded as well.
And in talking about students, your experiences of teaching and using the book in the classroom, Marsha, and Bob as well, your experiences since writing the original version of the book, what have students sort of taught you? What have you received from them that you've thought, this is where we should direct the book, I should place the emphasis, or this is something that students really respond to well?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I'm in a very unusual position right now, which is that I am actually teaching Introduction to Film this semester with the 4th edition of the textbook that Bob wrote on his own, because our edition wasn't available yet, even though it was fully written. It was just going through the publishing process. So I'm actually really glad it worked out this way, because it gave me the experience of changing up some of the material I was teaching in the class, which is reflected in the new book, which of course they weren't reading. For example, I taught Moonlight, the Barry Jenkins film. What I learned from that is that my students respond tremendously to this film, that about a third of them had seen it before, about 2/3 had not, that formally it could not be a bigger gift. It is so well crafted in terms of its attention to things like color, camera movement, sound, all of these kind of great fundamentals of film form that we talk about in the book. And it's a great film to look at clips from for doing close reading exercises, because Jenkins and his cinematographer and his editor are so attentive to the kind of visual landscape in this film. And so that I had not taught that in an introduction to film class before. And that was actually a recommendation of one of my colleagues when we were casting about for what are some films that you think we should consider including in this edition. And I'm so glad that made it into the revised edition, because the students found it innovative, formally beautiful, really relevant in terms of the kind of questions that it raises about social inequity, sexuality. And so that was a nice experience of teaching the new with the old, and it worked fine. And it'll work even better now that there's a section that they can read about some of that on their own and then come into class thinking about it a little bit outside of class. And I'll mention one other thing, which is that I did not teach Get Out in its entirety in the class, but I did show the clip that we talk about in the book, which is the opening scene from the film, which is just brilliantly constructed. I'm a big admirer of Jordan Peele's 2017 film. And it was such a perfect example of a really innovative fill form. Instead of cutting, the camera kind of moves in these kind of forward and loop around motions, so that you're getting,
It breaks the rule, doesn't it?
it breaks the rule. And so whenever you can show rule breaking, so it's not going to be using shot, reverse shot, it's not going to be using cutting. Instead, it's using camera movement in order to create a very eerie, uncanny feeling and to reveal more to the viewer than to the character on screen. And it's a very easy scene to find. I'm sure on YouTube, there's probably clips everywhere. And so again, that was a great proof of concept that, like, here's this just one scene that we talk about in the book that worked so well in terms of asking the students, well, what do you see here? What's different about this than what we've been looking at? How does it sound? It's also sonically very innovative. There's a very irritating little noise that's kind of like a quiet background, non-diegetic, not from the world of the film noise, that the first time you watch the clip, most of the students didn't hear, right? It took watching it a second time. And so anyhow, that was also a very teachable, it's good to see the new material working so well in the classroom, even though they're not reading the new textbook yet.
It's very hard to explain and describe the textbook market because it's so big and so filled with competing voices. So for a while, Film, Form, and Culture was published by McGraw-Hill, who also published Bordwell and Thompson. And so there was this sort of balancing act, or I should say imbalancing act, because certainly Bordwell and Thompson is the film textbook. And here was this little pipsqueak coming along and saying similar things in a more condensed way and with a visual, active visual component. So it was interesting to watch how the book entered this large field and came into its own.
I remember having a friend who told me that the most teachable film for him was Don't Look Now, because it just had everything in there, editing, color, music, acting, everything was there. And you could almost teach an entire course and just use clips from Don't Look Now. But Bob, I wanted to ask you if there's a particular film that you think has this, illustrates so much that you can use it in class.
Well, I don't know that there is one film. When I was teaching the course, the introductory course, there were a series of films, each one of them illustrating points that needed to be made. Obviously, Citizen Kane. Less obviously, 40s melodramas. We have a large section in the book on, the name escapes me, a Warner Brothers 40s melodrama.
Now, Voyage.
Yeah, yes, right. Betty Davis and Paul Henreid. And it's films like those that allow the student to grasp the details so that as we move chronologically up to the current period and wind up showing them a film like Taxi Driver, which is in itself a kind of textbook of film form and film history. They have under their belts, as it were, the foundation for understanding the new.
May I give this one a shot? Because again, I'm teaching it this semester, so this is all very fresh and relevant to me. After spending a little time and talking about film history and the invention of the medium, my opening film for them was Rear Window, and it could not have worked any better. First off, many of the students, much to my shock, had never seen an Alfred Hitchcock film. So that was something to learn from, that I presume that everyone has seen at least one or two. That is not any longer the case. I think only one of them had actually seen Rear Window before. And they were so completely seduced and wowed by this film. They loved it. They had big smiles on their faces when they were leaving the room. They felt like they had just been given this gift. And then it was so tremendously teachable, right? It has got so many things going on with the idea of looking and the gaze, with identification, with all of these really important ideas that are fundamental to thinking about why film became such a successful medium in the first place. And so to begin to unpack some of that and to look at the way the camera moves, to look at the way that color is used, to look at the way shot reverse shot is used in that film was just, a really wonderful experience and a reminder of how powerful a film that is quote unquote old, to them, this is ancient history, right? To them, the 80s is ancient history, this young generation. But then kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, I would say 6 weeks later, I taught Bicycle Thieves, the Vittorio De Sica Italian neorealist film. And I mean, they just felt gutted by this film and so moved by it. And several of them said, that's my favorite thing we've seen so far, which really surprised me. I thought that would feel a little more like medicine to them for some reason. Maybe it's the black and white. And I know, and it's not in English, which these are barriers, right? To especially young people that haven't seen a lot of older and non-English language films. But they were so compelled by and astute about what not only what neorealism was doing to what had developed as a kind of Hollywood dominant continuity style, but then also what its legacy has been. So since then, we've looked at Jafar Panahi's No Bears. This week, we're doing Wendy and Lucy, the wonderful Kelly Reichardt film about a girl and her dog. And it's really, it's wonderful to kind of weave this tapestry for them and to kind of share with them these things. I don't feel like students have to love every film that you show them. As a matter of fact, I often find that teaching films that I don't particularly like is as effective as something that I care deeply about. But it is nice also to see them really kind of fall in love with certain concepts through films and certain directors through films and really feel like they're being introduced to a time and a place and a way of making films that they didn't know existed before, even though they've seen evidence that it exists in films they're watching today.
I had an interesting opposite experience. I showed my class the Chantal Akerman film, Jean Dielman.
Wow.
A film that was just voted the best film ever made by the Sight and Sound survey. And I told them that this was going to be a difficult film. I gave them an introduction and put the film on and mistakenly left the room while it was running. And when I came back, maybe a half hour or so later, they were in chaos. They were yelling at the screen. Cut already, they were yelling. Cut, please cut. And I had to calm them down. Again, explain to them that this was different, that this was the kind of film that we were leading up to, in a sense, in talking about editing, in talking about shot content, in talking about thematic content. And it didn't satisfy them, but they watched it till the end, and I think at least quieted down and took their medicine.
I admire your moxie for teaching that film, not only because, oh my gosh, it's so long, but it's such an extraordinary film. It almost feels like a film that you couldn't teach in a week because of its scale, that you would need a couple of weeks. Maybe I'll have the courage to try it one day.
I find that particular film a kind of anti-film in that it does the opposite of a lot of the conventions, and therein the value lies. But in showing it to a class, that's why I'm not surprised that you're thinking, maybe this should have gone right at the end of the course, because it's almost like here's somebody who knows all the rules and is disrupting them, disrupting all the conventions to get you out of thinking convention.
Well, that was the point. If you can lay the ground of convention and teach them, and this is a really important theme that runs through the book, that the conventions are just that. They are not given from heaven, that film developed intuitively, filmmaking devices developed intuitively. Nobody had a textbook. They tried out and figured out what worked. The shot, reverse shot, dialogue sequence worked the best. It was easy to set up. It conveyed what had to be conveyed, which was usually exposition. And it became a kind of automatic device. So once we teach what is automatic, then we can move to the opposite and say, here's something that knows all the devices, that is aware of all the conventions, and is going to flout them.
But I think, you could say the same thing you said, John, about Jean Dielman.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
And about Psycho, right? What's the convention? You don't kill your heroine off in, the first part of the movie, right? Like, the reason that works, the reason it's so shocking is that the convention is that you don't do that, right? So any great filmmaker who is studied in the conventions knows how to break those conventions to great effect, right? And it's part of why these things get reinvented, and there are surprises, and there's twists and turns in the way that films tell their stories and what happens within them.
Yeah, I just want to make absolutely clear, I'm not in any way dissing Chantal Akerman's film. It's just purely that when you put a film right at the top there, it's like you're almost saying to people, if you don't watch any films at all, just watch this one. Mm-hmm. And I didn't feel that film was meant for that function, let alone, there are films that I put in my top 10 that I would never have, I put Shoah in the top 10, but I would not say, number one, this is the film that, that you typifies everything, because it doesn't.
Well, let me just speak to that, because
sure.
it's not irrelevant to the process of writing a textbook, which is that lists are inherently flawed and problematic, because what is the criteria, really? What does it mean to say something is the greatest? The greatest for what? For everybody? No. The greatest for teaching, the greatest for studying, the greatest for watching on a Friday night, there's all of these different things that just get erased. But it does raise an important question, which is one of canon. And we talk about Jean Dielman in the book. And I say we in the most generous way to myself, because this is something that has been in the book, for many years. This was Bob's inclusion. I think we might have expanded on it a little bit, but the point is that when you are making decisions about what to include in a textbook, Citizen Kane, remains, but we, shaved off a number of, significant directors and films in order to make space for bringing in new directors and films. So for every, Get Out and Wonder Woman and Black Panther and Moonlight that you bring in, we couldn't change the length of the textbook. We couldn't just add 100 pages, right? So, the canon is always shifting. And, Bob, it would actually be interesting to look back at the 1999 edition and what are the films that changed over time? What got added, what got taken away? And who knows what will come back? It's really interesting to think about the life of a textbook and how it reflects not only the authors who write it, right? Because we're bringing our our interests, our knowledge to bear, but then also we're thinking about who's reading the textbook and what their frame of reference is, because I do think it's important that you are teaching new material, but that you're also attempting not to fully alienate your reader who may have no familiarity with, say, Rear Window, for example, but knows every Marvel film, like the back of their hand. So it's an interesting line to walk, and I hope we did it with grace.
We also, I think, seeded the book for future textbooks and certainly for future courses. In particular, talking about the extraordinary belated rise of women filmmakers, particularly in streaming and television. We didn't have space to cover that in great detail, but we did mention it and tried to point out this was something that deserved attention.
Well, for example, if I may add to that, for example, in this revision of the textbook, when we talk about studio era directors in Hollywood, now the directors are Dorothy Arzner, Ida Lupino, and Alfred Hitchcock, right? So we are weaving the story of women's contributions to the film industry into the narrative of film history, which is as it should be, even though we also have to acknowledge that women were very intentionally excluded from the studio system. So I think it creates an interesting tension that we wanted to try to kind of play out for the students. So it's not a buried part of the history. It is just a fact of the history, and acknowledging, the kind of process of change in terms of things like gender equity, for example.
And implying that the change is away from the theatrical feature and moving slowly, painfully into the streaming platform. Jane Campion's Power of the Dog would not exist were it not for Netflix. And this is an extraordinary film on so many levels, on generic levels, as a rethinking of the Western, on levels of gender, and on the level of the fact that it was done by a strong woman filmmaker and got the kind of distribution that it would never have had were it theatrically shown only.
The same could be said of Ava DuVernay's 13th documentary, which we also talk about in the textbook, right? This is all tied into contemporary media history and Netflix's influence and impact on that industry, right? And that the access to audience that you have through Netflix, or it has been, right? Netflix has been struggling, thriving in the pandemic, and now the streamers are all trying to figure out how to stay alive. I mean, in 10 years, will there be, what will the media landscape be, right? We don't know. We can only see what's in front of us and maybe predict a little bit about what is right around the corner. But it is undeniable that that Netflix has had a tremendous impact on the past decade or so of filmmaking.
What I love as well is the sense of, I think Bob mentioned it earlier as well, the sense of film history, but also from sort of physical point of view. Film literacy is about knowing what is done because that's easy to do physically or on the ground, or the talking earlier about the dominance of reverse shot because it's an easy way of setting up. I remember a director telling me once that they love the French reverse, somebody doing the dialogue straight to camera, and then you don't swap the background, you swap the character, and it looks like they're talking to each other. And that's once you hear that and you see some films, you go, they're especially independent movies, they're using that. So I think grounding, the thing that's interesting in the textbook is grounding a knowledge of film also in sort of how films get made, because sometimes the discourse about films, the role of the producer and such like, it isn't particularly realistic and it isn't particularly fair.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I've always appreciated about this book, which has carried over and been updated in some ways, but structurally really is Bob's invention, I believe, in the first edition, is the outlining of all of the creators that go into making a film, right? So we have this Storytellers of Film series of chapters where we talk about the creative craftspeople and the cinematographer and the editor and the sound designers and the composer and the screenwriter and the producer. And then we talk about acting, screen acting, right? And we talk about the history of different methods for acting and for performance and how that's translated at different times, that acting in the 1950s stylistically was very different than contemporary acting. And then we take a whole chapter to talk about the director and to talk about the history of that particular role, right? That has changed a lot over time, really different in the 19 teens than it was during the studio era, where the director, for the most part in the American studio system, was given assignments and didn't have a lot of creative control over what came out the other end. That was all in the hands of the producer, to the contemporary day where, depending upon the context of the film being made, directors can have a lot of control, like in the example of someone like Kelly Reichardt, who is financing truly independent films, to filmmakers who are really kind of under the thumb of the financial interests of a kind of corporate conglomerate. So I think it's really important to take the time in this book to delineate some of those things, to demystify some of those credit lines. I mean, when you watch the credits now in a film, you can take a good 10 minutes to get through those credits, right? There are a lot of people who work on films, and that I think is important also in relationship to another key concept in film studies, and certainly is discussed in every introduction to film class, which is the auteur, and this romantic idea of the director as the author of his or her films. And we spend a lot of time in the textbook talking about why that was historically important, to imagine the director as a creator, and also to acknowledge that it's a myth and a fiction, because filmmaking is so inherently collaborative. There are so many people involved in the making of a film. There are very few films that are really the sole creation of an individual.
I was just thinking about that recently because I was watching Francis Ford Coppola's Megalopolis. Is getting there's rumors about it. It's being shown. Yep. It's probably going to turn up in Cannes in a few weeks' time. And I was thinking of Coppola, I might be totally wrong about this, but I was thinking of him as sort of someone who is often put in the club of the auteurs, but really kind of isn't. His best films are very, very collaborative. They're very, very, Apocalypse Now with John Milius and Michael Herr and people like that, and Godfather with Mario Puzo and his amazing cast. I'm not sure. That's just I'm just throwing it out there. If you want to come and give me a punch for that idea, I'm quite.
Well, there are filmmakers who shine through a few films, and then either the light goes out, or they just begin making ordinary films. I haven't seen the latest Coppola, of course, but certainly here's a director who made three terrific films, The Two Godfathers and The Conversation, especially The Conversation, which is a remarkable piece of work. And then, made a grand opera war film with Apocalypse Now, and sort of then did, to my mind, ordinary work. So the auteur theory has its interesting twists and turns.
But it is a very convenient and useful way to study film, right? And that's why it has sustained itself. I mean, I have taught classes, for example, on Nicholas Ray, Sam Fuller, and Douglas Sirk. And it's very convenient to say, okay, here's three, American, well, not born American, but American directors in this period of time, working in very different ways, in different contexts, coming at issues from different perspectives, formally very radically different. And it's very useful. And it's very, I think the students and those of us who teach and write about film can often wrap our heads around things because of the auteur theory. It gives us a container. And even the way Bob just very elegantly went through his thinking about Coppola, I mean, that's a perfect example, right? To say that someone is an auteur does not mean, that every single one of their films is a masterpiece. That's not the point. It's besides the point. But it is to talk about the way that their career and their interests have informed the films that they've made over an arc of time.
Yeah, I mean, I got the feeling it was a little bit more than that in the sense that the idea was each individual film, you would get the DNA of the author would be there. And I find it difficult to find the DNA of Jack and the DNA of The Godfather as being of the same filmmaker, and it's missing too much DNA, which is probably the other that metaphor's gone on too long, which is the other collaborators and even just the historical cultural moment that he was a part of in the 1970s and not a part of to a great extent, maybe with the exception of Dracula in the 80s and 90s. But one thing I did want to ask about as well is I had a great experience late last year of going to the Tallinn Black Nights Film Festival, and I was participating on some panels there where they were talking very specifically about education and film literature. And they had a really vertical sort of structure of primary school through the entire school system to college and beyond, not only of practical sort of learning how to use film, but how to watch film. And one of the arguments they had for why we need film literacy to be part of the school curriculum was because you're also creating your future audience. That it's not just about higher level students who are going to write their doctorates and whatnot, but it's also just about kids having the capacity to have a broad appreciation of film. What do you think of that as a sort of notion? Is that something?
Well, I think at base, a good intro to film course is the same as a good literature course. It teaches students how to think, how to put things together, how to understand history, how to see context, how to understand that a film just doesn't drop from heaven, that it is made not only by individuals, but by the history that surrounds it, and therefore serves a very interesting function beyond simply teaching an appreciation of film.
I will add that I'm always fascinated when I get the rosters for my classes to scan who they are. What major are they? What's their minor? What year are they? And I mean, this semester I have engineering, computer science, biology, in addition to film and English and philosophy and history and zoology. I have students from all over the university. Of course, introduction to film classes often fulfill some kind of a prerequisite or, something within the university. In my case, they have to take a visual studies class. It also fulfills a global knowledge co-requisite because it's so global in orientation. But I often find myself most interested in the way these students come to me and what they take out of the class and the way they learn. Often if engineering students at my institution at North Carolina State University basically get one elective, that's free. And if they're taking this as their elective, what of all the classes in the university, what makes them come to it? And the answer is a version of that they have always loved movies and they want to understand them, that they have no idea how they're made or how they construct meaning. Why do they feel scared when they watch A Quiet Place? Why do they, these, I would say important questions about the way media works on us, right? And there are very dark reasons having to do with propaganda and social manipulation that it's really important to understand these things. But so I really appreciate when those students come into my classes, even though I know this will probably be the only time they study film, they take it that seriously. I do think that even taking an introduction to film class sends them out into the world and into their lives as scientists or, technologists or accountants or whatever it may be, just with a more savvy and sophisticated understanding of something that they will continue to engage with for the rest of their lives, right? This is going to be part of their lives. And, maybe they get to be that wonderfully articulate person after the movie when they go there with their friends or families and helps have a conversation about what's just been seen. And so I think those kinds of ripple effects, I think they're actually significant. And I love the idea of this being part of a curriculum that goes back earlier into students' educations. And there's certainly, I've heard of nothing like that in the United States. But I love that there are countries, there are institutions, thinking about how to propagate that in their own cultures.
You're talking about the future, and we've talked about several times about the future in this conversation, changes in terms of people. There was a time, it was like, even I think in my memory, where it was a little bit like Aristotle, who had, according to legend, read every book that was in existence at the time. And we were like that about films back in the 80s. It was kind of possible to have watched more or less everything. You know what I mean? That you had that canon that was readily there and was containable. Nowadays, it feels like every year we're creating more and more films, and we're opening up so much globally that Nollywood and Tollywood and Bollywood have it's becoming almost impossible to, but at the same time, it's so rich and so wealthy. So are we looking at the future in a way which is incredibly hopeful in terms of how cinema continues, or is it going to change beyond recognition and we're going to be talking about something else in another 100, 150, 200 years' time?
First of all, there must be a terrific Mel Brooks joke in the notion of Aristotle reading every book that was ever written. Will it change? Of course it'll change. It's changing as we look at it now. Theatrical moviegoing, while it has revived since the pandemic, is still not great. At the same time, there are filmmakers, Christopher Nolan, for example, who insist on a strong theatrical placement of their films, and that somehow the full effect can only be gained by watching it on a big screen. One can argue that. But I think we know who's going to win and what's going to win. And what we try to do in the book is to present all of those possibilities, to not only talk about the past and the present of filmmaking, but to indicate that there is more change afoot.
Yeah, speaking of that, I spent the past 4 days at the Full Frame Documentary Film Festival in Durham, North Carolina. And one of the films that played at the festival is called Eno, about Brian Eno, the musician, composer, producer.
Roxy Music, etc.
That's right. Directed by Gary Hustwit. And it was phenomenal. And the way that it is exhibited is fascinating. And it made me realize how much we don't know about what's to come, which is that the film consists of all of these units. There's a beginning and an end that's baked into the film. And then at each performance of the film, the content is AI generated within a matrix that the filmmaker has created software that makes these decisions. So it will never be seen the same way twice. It will never be played the same way twice. There are certain rules baked into the documentary. And this is such a lovely homage to Brian Eno's inventiveness, right? So it's very appropriate. This is not like, I'm not saying like, oh my gosh, every movie is going to be made this way, but just in terms of what technology facilitates that couldn't have happened, 2 years ago, right? A year ago, even. Now, here's a possibility. It is interesting in this context. Would you want to do this with every film? No, but maybe there's a future where film is more interactive, right? This has been a promise that film has held out at various moments in history. Maybe there's a way in which it is less structured and fixed. And so I was just intrigued by it was kind of like cracking open another door. Like, okay, well, that's an interesting concept. Maybe this is the only film that will ever be made this way. Or maybe I just saw something that gestures towards a way that that moving images might form, right? A fungible form that is appropriate for telling certain kinds of stories. So the point is we don't know what's to come, right? We know certain pathways, but there's many things that have not yet happened, and it's exciting to think about, what innovations are around the corner. And I just hope that the movie theaters do indeed stick around. And I'm given hope by the fact that my students seem to really love seeing movies in movie theaters. If we can just get some better movie theaters and better exhibition context instead of just mall multiplexes.
And better movies.
And better movies. Actually, last year was, I think, a pretty decent movie year, all things considered. I saw a lot of good stuff last year and a lot of smaller budget, smaller scale movies that were not, in the superhero ginormous budget, constant spectacle, too fast editing mode.
I would also say that the expansion of people's horizons beyond Hollywood is always a good thing when it comes to the old better movies argument, because I've just watched the new Quentin Dupieux film from France, and there's a film, The Settlers from Chile, and there's The Teacher's Lounge from Germany last year. And there are just
La Chimera from Italy. Alice Rohrwacher was extraordinary.
And I just think, so if you don't want superheroes, there's literally everywhere else in the world you can look and find other things, And also there was an article in the New York Times, I think, saying that IMAX might well be the future of cinema, simply because it's so different to your home experience, and it's a continuing success story that people, when they go to the cinema, want to go to see films in IMAX.
Totally possible. I would not throw down one way or the other on that. That's a very specific context. So I'm not sure how ubiquitous that could be.
A lot to do with the production costs as well. Listen, Marsha and Bob, there's one last thing I wanted to ask. I wanted to mention as well, because we mentioned his name earlier, and of course he passed recently, David Bordwell. I wanted to ask about, being in the same field as David and having, writing a textbook in the context of David's work as well. And just get your thoughts generally on that.
Oh, David played the role of public intellectual really well.
Yeah, I mean, he was so responsible for bringing the discipline of film studies into a more mainstream public realm. And so, yeah, all kudos to Bordwell for taking on that role, as Bob and I both know from the writing that we've done that's oriented to a general audience, such as his recent biography of Stanley Kubrick, which is amazing, by the way.
Yeah,
And
we've had an episode on that already, and I think Bob will say there's been a huge spike in sales since the podcast has been released.
Oh, good.
Good. But so we've both, written books for a general readership, and it's a lot of work to engage with the general public. And so Bordwell really did a phenomenal job with orienting a lot of his intellectual energy outside of the academy. And so, so it's an honor to be writing in the same space.
Circling right back to what we started at the beginning, it's, I think it's incumbent on writers on film, writers who are writing about filmmakers, to include that elegance which you spoke about at the very beginning, Marsha, in their own writing. So you can't really criticize other people if you're not paying care and attention to the thing that you're doing and supposed to be doing well. So it's wonderful to have this film form, and no, I've got it wrong, haven't I? It's
film form and culture.
Film form and culture. There you go.
Take it from the top. Go ahead.
No, okay, film form and culture. a brilliant book, and it is a really a great book to read, even outside of any educational context, just as a popular introduction to film.
Well, thank you. And I just want to mention that if anyone is listening to this who is a professor of film studies, if you go to the Routledge website, you can order an examination copy of the book for consideration in your classes, and you can also see some of the web content that is up there, including what I think is a pretty amazing glossary resource on the website. So.
Yeah, it's excellent. Brilliant work, guys. Very well done. And I hope to talk to you at some point in the future.
Thank you so much, John. We appreciate it.
Selling a little or a lot? Shopify helps you do your thing however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit a million orders stage. Shopify is there to help you grow. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout. 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Get a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/work. Shopify.com/work.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.